Thank you so much for inviting us, and we're excited to be here. I'm Valerie Ackerson, and I was an instructor of a course that included these doctoral students, and we are sharing some ideas and things that happened and changes in practice that took place as a result of the course. We did some research in the class, so we're not really talking about the research, but if anyone has questions about the research, we'd be happy to answer those as well.
So hello, I'm Claire, and I'm a graduate student who's part of the course. And we just wanted, before we started, we wanted to ask our Dr. Akerson, why is NOS, or Nature of Science, your research area? And why are you interested in teaching a graduate level course about nature of science practices?
So when I was an elementary teacher, way back when, there were very few teachers that actually liked teaching science or that even taught science. And I think it's because they didn't realize what science actually was. So they thought it was information to memorize and text that their students would find boring. But in fact, if they understood the kind of knowledge that that science was, so if they understood the nature of science, scientific knowledge, I felt like they would have a better understanding of science and also a better attitude toward it and be more willing to teach it to their own students. So I ended up focusing on the nature of science because I do prepare elementary teachers. And the reason I wanted to teach a graduate class on the nature of science is because I knew for my own self, when I came to my doctoral program, I didn't know what the nature of science was, and I learned it, and I wished I had learned it sooner. So I thought maybe that might be the case for other people. So now I have a few questions for the panel. Did you experience shifts in ideas around teaching and learning about the nature of science? And if so, how did you experience these changes, and how did they affect your opinions of science education? Claire, would you answer that one for us first?
Sure. So in my position, I used to be a middle school science teacher, and I was lucky enough to find the nature of science teaching ideas in my own curricular searches and research. And I applied nature of science in my classroom often, and found that teaching about it really helped. Teaching nature of science really helped my students learn about the practices of science. And this led to not only more engagement, but also I noticed that my students were more readily able to build schema and understandings around scientific concepts and phenomena after they understood how science went about finding out about the scientific phenomena and these concepts, and in what context science resides to do that. So I really enjoyed nature of science, and I'm really happy to have taught it in my middle school classroom, and then come to graduate school and be able to reinforce the power that nature of science has in the science classroom. For positive conceptual change and understandings.
Great. And Jessica, how about you?
Sure. So my background is similar to Claire. I was also a middle and high school science teacher before I started my PhD program. Prior to that, I have degrees in science, so a master's and bachelor's in biology. So nature of science was something completely new that I did not learn until I literally took Dr. Akerson's class. For me, it really made sense to me how we learned about the nature of science and how it should be taught. What I taught my students was definitely the scientific method down to a T. But now, after learning the nature of science in the course, I really feel like I failed my students a little bit, but I didn't know what I know now. So I'm glad I took the class in order to be a little bit more cognizant about how we should really teach and impact students as far as understanding science in a better way.
Great, thanks. Hey, Tuli, how have your perspectives of teaching experiences changed after being exposed to the nature of science?
Hi, I'm Tuli. Well, actually, I was born and raised in Sri Lanka, so I did my bachelor's in Sri Lanka in chemistry and also master's in chemistry in the United States. So So before I started learning nature of science with Professor Akerson, I was looking at things from a scientist eye, but after I, well, actually, just after I enrolled to the program, my PhD program, I started learning NOS. So after learning NOS, while I was learning NOS, I was able to see the world and see the things from non-science, social sciences eye, science from non-science and social science eye.
Cool, thank you. Shukufe, can you answer the same question?
Yeah, sure. Before I start answering my question, so I'm Shukufe Rahman and I'm the graduate student in India University and I'm also from Bangladesh. Before I start my PhD program, I have been working as a curriculum developer in Bangladesh, India and China. And I have done my bachelor and master's in applied physics. So prior to my PhD program and also with the course with Dr. Akerson, I haven't been introduced with that nature of science, though I have been spent a lot of time in my science career. So what I interpret from this course that I really understand how science works and how scientists works and how the scientific community now functions. And I want to instill that understanding and attitude toward the science to my students. So I want to implement that nature of science into my teaching experiences so that my students can see the science from the various perspective and multiple understanding. That science is not only a body of knowledge, it can be understood and understand from your own experiences and social and natural lives.
Great. And as you can see, we're fortunate to have students from a few different countries. So we're going to see if they can tell us a little bit about how the nature of science is positioned in their country. Tuli, you want to start?
Sure. Well, actually, in Sri Lanka, when I was doing my bachelor's in chemistry, I didn't know what is nature of sciences. I was taking few classes in science education. I was teaching, but no no nature of science as from its name itself. But I learned few bits and pieces of nature of science, but not as nature of science.
Zhu, would you like to share your ideas?
Sure. Hi, my name is Zhong. I'm from China. So in China, in the past, we don't have nature of science in the curriculum. But since from 2017, we issued a new standard, elementary science standard that include some new concept, engineering, STEM, and including the philosophy or the nature of science into the new curriculum. So we're starting doing it, but there's a long way to go.
Conghui, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm Conghui. I'm also from China. So that's what we are doing for the policies. And for my personal experience, I haven't heard about nature of science before I came here. But after I learned the nature of science, I talked to some of my friends working in China, and they are working on implement nature of science into science classroom.
And Shukufe.
So again, I'm from Bangladesh, and though as a low economic country and Southeast Asian country, science is a priority subject in our country, but we haven't taught nature of science enter in our science curriculum, and I don't think still is there. And as an educational researcher, I also believe that if I want to implement that in my country curriculum or material science textbooks, I need some viable reason to actually address this need of nature of science to the policymakers and curriculum developer and the teachers in our context.
Makes sense. So how has your experience teaching nature of science changed since taking the class, Andrea?
I'll say, yeah, definitely. My name's Andrea. I'm from the Western USA. But since taking the course, I've had the chance to teach elementary science methods again. So I was teaching it at the time that we were taking the course, and then I'm teaching it again now. And I've spent a lot more time introducing and framing all the activities in terms of NOS, as well as encouraging my students to find opportunities to implement NOS instruction into their own lessons. I'm not an expert at it yet. I will say that I feel like I miss a lot of opportunities, and in retrospect, I'll see lots more opportunities to connect to NOS. but I'm definitely feeling better about my teaching, knowing that I'm trying to implement this and aiming for better literacy for my pre-service teachers and hopefully for their future students as well.
Shukufe, how about you?
So as I have said before, that Nature of Science was totally new to me, and it is a new addition to my learning, also and to my teaching experiences. So after learning that, I was trying my best to implement in every teaching materials that I'm using or activities I'm trying to do with my students. Also, I want my students to reflect back what they have learned from that Nature of Science tenets, and also I want them to find the opportunity in their other learning, not only the science content knowledge, maybe they can find in other content knowledge where they can implement or they can see the tenets of the Nature of Science.
Great. So I know that all of you teach at the university as well, and you're graduate assistants. Do you find any constraints as a graduate assistant in teaching the nature of science? Jessica, how about you share?
Absolutely. So what happened was this: while we were taking the class, I was teaching the science methods course, which was perfect because I felt like it was a good time where I could implement the things that I was learning in Dr. Akerson's class. My big issue was, while I found it useful, we use this term theory to practice. So taking it from what I'm learning in the class into the actual classrooms that my students were in, I found some difficulty. So for me, the big thing was, while I see value in the nature of science and I see value that my students understand it, how can we then take it from this concept into something that is useful for students in service and both pre-service teachers to use? What I do know is that different universities, different school systems will have different curriculum and different sets of things they'll have to do when they get into the classroom. So my issue was making sure that it's something that the students can actually take and implement easy on top of the other ideas and things they have to do. So that was my big constraint.
Good. Andrea, the same question.
Yeah, so I'll say that especially starting out graduate work, who you're supervised by plays a big role in what you teach. So at the time I was taking this course, it was my first time teaching a methods class. So I was given a lot of instruction and a lot of guidance with how to structure that class and what to teach and what to focus on. And the person I was supervised by didn't necessarily forefront NOS, and so I didn't end up teaching NOS as something that my pre-service teachers should implement in their own instruction. But now that I'm in my later years of grad work, teaching methods, I have a little more freedom, I guess a lot more freedom. But those constraints were definitely there the first time, and this time I'm feeling a lot less constrained because I can choose what I want to focus on. So I was definitely wanting to teach it. Taking the NOS course at the time, I was wishing that I was implementing more of NOS into my instruction. So I'm glad that now that I have a little more freedom, I can do that and try to forefront NOS a little more.
Great. That's good to hear from my perspective. Did learning about the nature of science change your perspective of how you interact with science in your own personal and student life? How about you, Chu?
Yeah, sure. So personally for myself, after learning nature of science, I become more critical about what you hear from the TV, from the news, from the newspaper. So whenever I read the news, scientific news, I want to know that, how do you know, like what kind of method you're using to know those kind of things, and how robust is the evidence. And I began to looking at things from multiple perspectives, not just science, but also social perspectives. And because scientific knowledge is also social embedded. And also, I initiated several interesting conversations with my friends because some of my friends, they said that I believe in science. And then I challenged them, do you know what is science? And then they told there, I don't. So I kind of have a conversation, and it's pretty interesting because most of them from a very solid science background, and they feel challenged about, oh, I don't know what is science, but I claim myself as a scientist. So that's pretty interesting. And also, when I teach my students, I also encourage them to challenge my ideas. So I think that's pretty interesting for my personal life and also for my teaching.
Great. How about you, Jessica?
Yes, so in a world full of miscommunication and misinformation, I feel that now more than ever, NAS has entered my life in a very strange way. Similar to Joe, I've definitely had conversations with friends and the response has not been so forthcoming, but I'm still yet working on them. As far as my own personal life, I have definitely saw a need for it. When I think about my own research focus, it's more of an equity in STEM. So I had an opportunity this summer to create a curriculum for a summer bridge program. And a part of that, I made sure to have NAS embedded in their lessons to make sure that they were exposed to it early. So for me, I definitely see fit, but it's also important that we have that when we think about equity and that social embeddedness and making sure that everyone is exposed at the same time and making sure that everyone has the opportunity to understand the concepts which they might not have been exposed to before. I would say that's about it.
Sounds good. So do you find that social and cultural embeddedness of NAS helped you bridge cultural and geographical gaps between how we understand and interact with science? Tuli?
Yeah, that's my favorite tenet of nature science. Well, actually, I would say that even many of us, a few of us, have learned in Asian countries. I'm from South Asia. We have all learned Western science. It's not an insult, but like that's a stream of science that we have learned all. So, but we know that some different types of sciences are there, like indigenous medicines in different countries, such as like in Sri Lanka and as like in China, and Native American people have their own sciences, and so we cannot ignore these things. But I think we can understand and the way that they are thinking, how they are thinking, and how it was how those were constructed can be understood by using nature of science, I would guess.
Great. How about you, Shukufe?
Yeah, that's also my favorite one. So, so yeah, because I think we really understand this cultural thing, because like we are from different culture and pursuing the nature of science in the Western cycle or Western conception. So it is really important. We can understand the difference between how we pursue the science in our context and how they are pursuing this Western context. But again, one of the important thing now in this century is that due to the globalization and mobilization, it is important for us and also for our students to see the view the world from the different perspectives, because we need to instill that they have to see some of the way of knowing or interacting with the science in different contexts and different ways. So it is the social and cultural embeddedness of nature of science help us to create that lens to see the world from multiple perspectives. Also, it helps us to reduce the gaps to see and interact the science from different geographical or dimensions. So it is important to instill that while we are teaching or learning nature of science, and also I believe we should explicitly mention about these tenets in our every activities.
Great, awesome. So did you find that there were better materials and activities that aided you in teaching the nature of science? Sangwei.
Yeah. We have a lot of materials for the course. We have readings, the book, What is this thing called science? And the book Valerie brought us that her undergraduate student create, which is wonderful. And we have the activities and lesson plans. My favorite is the peer teaching and the activities, because that provides me a way to see how others teach nature of science. Because I wasn't taught nature of science before I came here, and I didn't have enough teaching experience in formal school settings. So I don't know how to teach that, even though we have learned and agreed that nature of science should be taught explicitly. But what does that mean? So the opportunities for us to witness how other people teach nature science really helps. I love that.
That's great. Awesome. Jessica.
I feel like our lesson plans that we did were phenomenal and they were a great resource, especially to me. One thing that I love working with my colleagues is that we all have different perspectives when we try to process NOS during the class. So each lesson plan was unique and brought different perspectives that I didn't think of when we thought about NOS. So I felt that we were our best kept secret as far as understanding NOS.
That's true. I learned a lot too, when you're thinking about different perspectives. So that's great. How about you, Shukufe?
Okay, so I believe also because of Dr. Akerson and her plenty of work on the nature of science, and you will find a plenty of scholar articles in Google Scholar everywhere. So that really helps me to understanding nature of science, really, because I understand how I see myself or how I view the science. But I really honestly to be say that there is not enough materials out there when it comes to the teaching or helping out the teacher or supporting the teachers to teaching the nature of science. And my big fear is that, so whatever the materials are available, that's in English. So when I'm thinking about other countries, maybe in China or for my country, there will be not enough material that is translated, or there will be enough materials that can teachers use if they were interested in. So we as a education researcher maybe have a lot of thing to do with that material and the textbooks, everything regarding the nature of science.
Yeah, I agree with you. So when you're learning about nature of science as a graduate student, do you think you could have been better prepared in your undergraduate studies? How about you, Andrea?
Well, I would say definitely yes, is probably what we could all say, because none of us except for Claire had heard of NOS before starting this course. So that's a starter. And I think we talked a lot and learned a lot in this course about teaching NOS in an explicit and reflective manner and making sure that NOS is explicit and those ties to NOS are explicit. My undergraduate was in biology education, and so much of my coursework was in biology, but I think the biggest thing was, it wasn't that I wasn't taught about science as a way of knowing and how science works and what science is, but it's that it was left implicit. I recently I was sent an alumni survey from my undergraduate university, and the department asked me, one portion of the survey asked me if I felt confident in my understanding of the nature of science. And I was really surprised to see that question, because I knew for a fact they hadn't taught me the nature of science, because I'd never heard of it before starting my graduate work. So I think that just goes back to the importance of making sure that it's explicit if you intend to teach it. And if it's a learning outcome, you need to make sure that you're talking about it explicitly. So.
How about you, Conghui?
Yes, of course. So I will give my own experience as an example that when I was doing my master program, I did scientific research, but I was confused because I got some results. I don't know, am I doing it right? Is the result the fact? Are those things, is my theory perfect? There are always flaws. I can see the flaws. So I'm not confident with the result. But after I learned the nature of science, I think now I can better understand that that is what science is. It is science. It's not just, it's not me. So if I'm going to do the same research now, I think I will be much more comfortable with the result and the how we interpret the data. Same things to my undergraduate studies, although I didn't question myself those things. But when I think back to the things I learned in undergraduate studies, all the concepts, theories, laws, I just take them and memorize the terms. But do I really know what does the terms means? I don't. So I think if I learned nature of science by that time, I might be better prepared for deeper understanding of all of those concepts, theories, laws. And I feel it really helps.
Would help you. Yeah. Great. So let's think about, how about future plans for incorporating nature of science in teaching and research? Let's have a couple people share that. How about you, Cho?
Yeah, sure. So taking Valerie's classes really inspired me because I found myself is become so interested in learning nature of science. So I further took several courses in the philosophy department of Indiana University. So that several science philosophy courses. And then I found there's a lot to explore about nature of science, especially in education settings. For example, in the future, I would like to explore more about nature of science in specific discipline learning. For example, when you are learning chemistry, physics, or environmental science, you can embed learning nature of science in your single discipline learning. And say different single discipline learning, they focus on different aspect of nature of science. So for example, in physics, there's a lot like evidence-based observation, while for environmental science, especially for toxicology, there is a lot of uncertainties in this area. So I find that it's pretty interesting, and we need to do a lot of research in this area. And also for my future research, I'm pretty interested in modeling, the philosophy of nature of modeling, and especially about the climate modeling. So how do we know of the past and the future, and what kind of evidence we have, and how robust of the evidence for us to make future plans for the climate.
How about you, Claire? Because you've taught it before. Do you have future plans for what you would do now?
Yeah, so I'm currently teaching secondary science pre-service teachers in a methods course, and so part of the course they develop lessons and they teach it to the class. So we kind of have a mock experience of developing a lesson and teaching it, for one of our so I have different considerations that they need to do for their different lessons. And for one of them, I did have them focus on the nature of science. And it was very interesting and very successful because they were able to really take different parts and different tenets of the nature of science. Some of them were really interested in the tentativeness of it. Some of them were interested in the subjectivity. And we talked a lot about theory and law and what that is. And so it was interesting throughout them teaching these nature of science lessons for us. We were really able to talk about what science is, talk about why it is so important to teach the nature of science. And since I focused on being explicit and reflective with them, and in their reflections, I can really notice that they're at least starting to incorporate nature of science into their own pedagogies, and they're seeing the power that it has to understand how science works, how theory works, which is so important for secondary science teachers, to understand really how scientists develop scientific theories so that we can talk about them, and break misconceptions for their future students about science and what it can tell us and what it cannot. So that was really exciting, and I was really encouraged by that. So my research interests are exploring the intersection of ecological and social justices, and particularly how they are situated in the science classroom, how social justice and ecological justice are talked about and positioned, in the classroom. So I'm also very interested in the power that nature of science has, and this construct has to help facilitate shifts in teacher beliefs about how the study of science should be constructed in the classroom, moving towards a more equitable science classroom. And then for science learners, I'm also interested in how explicit teaching and learning of nature of science can promote conceptual change for students, and how this can assist in helping them create deeper understandings of the interconnectedness science has with society, with the environment, really with all things planet Earth. So I think that nature of science has the potential to be a really powerful vehicle for helping our students, our science students and science education see these big connections that we need to recognize in order to move to a more equitable and just science classroom. So yeah, I'm really excited about it.
Sounds great. I see the question in the chat, and we will respond to that question and in the end. So thank you so much for that question, and we'll get back to that. But right now I'm going to ask Andrea to look at her future.
Yeah, so I think I definitely hope to incorporate NOS into all of my future teaching, whether that be in teacher education or science content courses of any age. So I think that it's important and underlies and informs the practice of science and how science functions in our society. So I think it's really important to bring that into education for everyone for those reasons. As for research, I'm definitely interested in opportunities to explore NOS further, both how to teach it effectively and how NOS understanding influences other aspects of science learning. I'm also interested in NOS as it relates to identity development in science, and specifically how intersectionalities sort of influence NOS learning and NOS understanding. I'm especially interested in looking at how people perceive NOS as a way of knowing and as an epistemology as compared to something like religion. So how does religious identity influence the development of science identity, for example, and things like that. So I'm really interested in helping people embrace NOS and look at development of science identities coming from a variety of backgrounds. It's something I'm definitely interested in looking at.
Sounds interesting. All right, so finally, did teaching during the emergency remote learning that we all experienced during COVID-19, and we still are experiencing to some event, did it change the way you approach teaching the nature of science? Cho?
Yeah. So I taught nature of science during the pandemic for 2 semesters. One of the most important thing is we need to consider students' emotions. Because science is conducted by people and people have emotions. So do learning science. If students are experiencing difficulty in their families, it's really difficult for them to focus on what they learn in the class. So as an instructor, we should really acknowledge that they are experiencing a difficult time and to do whatever we can to support them to be successful, or let them know that it's okay to not feel okay and it's okay to feel difficult. But here is the instructor support you. And the secondly important thing is because it's difficult time, and we should help them to connect what they are learning during the class to the society they're experiencing. Because what they say in the society is such a chaos, and what we're learning nature of science. So it's important for them to use what they learn in the class to interpret what happened in the society and really help them to be a good citizen. Thank you.
How about you, Toli?
Yeah, I have a little, I'm totally agree with Sho, and I have a little addition to her comment. Yes, I also taught many times during last 2 semesters nature of science. So the first thing is that we need to understand the students' emotions and feelings. For an example, when I started teaching on Zoom, I was not very happy to teach them on blank screens. But we have learned so many things about the students' background and how they are attending Zoom and that kind of thing. So so then now I'm fine with that, because they have their own problems, and so I'm glad that they are attending to the class and learning nature of science. The other thing is with the pandemic, things happen in the society background and all over the world. Nature of science, when I was answerless, nature of science helped me to understand things for myself, to understand about the how sciences work, how the science and society is working, and how those are connecting and that kind of things to make it easy to understand nature of science help me. So those are the two things which help me, and the nature of science helped me
through the pandemic.
during the pandemic.
Quite a fun year.
Yeah.
And it keeps
Right.
going. So we want to leave you, we're not leaving you, but we want to share with you some implications. And we're each going to say a sentence of what we think is most important about the nature of science. So should we start with Joe?
Yeah, sure. So my one sentence is we cannot learn science content knowledge well unless we learn what is science and how science works.
Awesome. My takeaway is nature of science is teaching the nature of science has teaching and learning the nature of science, has great potential for shifting our perspectives in science education to move towards more equitable teaching and learning classroom, science classroom.
My take-home message is we are talking about interdisciplinary collaboration. So I would say that like collaboration between scientists and social science professionals and non-science professionals and so on. So I would say that nature of science is a kind of a good linkage to for the interdisciplinary collaborations.
I would say that my big takeaway is that we should continue to strive to make NOS the norm in science education. Just the same way that we've made practice as a norm, I think that science should be, or nature of science should be the same. And that means continuing to emphasize it in teacher education, but also improving on things like curriculum development, including NOS, and also making sure that NOS is clearly embedded throughout the science standards.
For me, the big takeaway is we need to start teaching it when we start teaching science, right when kids are in school, throughout their school careers, into their college careers, into their graduate careers. If we really want people to be scientifically literate, that has to be part of what we do when we teach science.
For me is that there is no doubt that teaching and learning nature of science is very important, while it is about science or any other understanding the science and how it works. But it's also important, it is very high time for us to look into that, how our science curriculum and textbooks giving the treatment to the nature of science.
I strongly feel that nature of science should not just limit it to science teachers and educators. We should spread it out.
So I'll wrap us up. My takeaway was think outside the box with nature of science. This class has given me an opportunity to think that we don't have to necessarily keep it just in one subject, but we should think at other areas where NOS will be useful for students as well as teachers.
Great. Thanks, everybody. And so that's our formal discussion, and we're ready to answer questions. If anyone has questions, and we'll start with the one that's in the chat. So I'm interpreting that as wondering whether the students in this room are teaching and how many students they typically have in their classes. So maybe each person who's teaching or who taught the nature of science, which is everybody, can say what they taught and which class they taught, and then how many students approximately they have in their classes.
I can speak to the science methods courses. At least in the elementary science methods class, this semester, the class sizes are a little smaller for whatever reason, pandemic, just the natural cycle of things. But right now the courses have about 15 students and there are 2 sections this semester. But in the past we have up to 24, yeah, about 24 students in each methods class. And usually there's 2 or 3 sections per semester.
Who else wants to pop in?
I will. I'm teaching, as I mentioned, the secondary science course, and it's a small class. I have 6 students this semester. Last semester, I had 4. Well, no, 2 semesters. It ranges from about 6 to 14. It tends to be a smaller class, which is very nice because we can have these deep conversations. But I will say that an idea or something that I've found to work before when I had a bigger class of middle school students was having them come up, with their own definitions. So for example, theory, what is a theory? I think when we can articulate that ourselves and start and have these conversations, and they can do it in small group or large group or even individually, on paper. But to have these conversations about how we are positioning things like, for example, theories and laws, scientific theory and law. And when they can articulate that and come up with their own definitions for that, rather than having them, copy the definition out of the book or look it up on Google. But when they can actually articulate it themselves, then I can understand as their teacher that they really are taking this in and have change in their conceptual understandings about different ideas in NAS.
Does anyone who was teaching a content course want to share? So we have a sample from each type of course.
Yeah, I'm teaching a general science course in IU. It's not just for students in school of ed. So it's a lab-based course. We have around 20 to 24 for each class. We have this semester we have 6 sections in total. I'm teaching two of them. So I have 40. I think I have 44 students this semester.
So I'm going to respond to the next question. What do you think are the major challenges in teaching and learning nature of science in an online class, and how to address these challenges? So for me, teaching online, at the beginning was very difficult because I never imagined myself teaching online. But because of COVID, we all got to learn how to teach online and do things better online. But at the beginning, I found it was very difficult. But the interesting thing is I'm now teaching an online graduate course about the nature of science, the same class that these students were in. So what I ended up doing is sort of creating modules using the same text and using the readings and having the students working through those modules and also making recordings of lessons, samples where they could see nature of science being enacted. So it's sort of, I guess that's one of the positives of COVID is kind of, I got better at teaching online and I am able to prepare that. And if anybody wants, I can't read the name because I'm too far away, but if you want to contact me, I'm happy to share my syllabus or ideas about how to teach those online. Does anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I just want to share not the challenge, because there's a lot of challenges because we used to have a lot of hands-on activities. We cannot do it anymore.
Yeah.
We need to figure out other things that they can do whether individually or online. So there's a lot of work to do. But I want to share one positive aspect during pandemic for online teaching nature of science. Because teaching nature of science, we need a lot of reflections and discussions. And for students who are not willing to talk a lot in a classroom, they are actually marginalized. So we never know what they think. But actually, I found that some of students, they don't talk, but they think a lot. During the online teaching, I find it very useful to engage them into other ways of sharing their thoughts. They put their thinking and discussion through the chat a lot. And also they share their thinkings on Google Doc very often. So that's one aspect I think. Using some online tools is really helpful to engage students to share their thinkings if they don't want to talk.
It's a good positive. True. So I'm looking at the next one. The elementary school curriculum is largely dedicated to literacy and math in the USA. That is so true. And is not something that could be incorporated into either of these subjects. I think yes. So one of the assignments that we do in our elementary methods class is to incorporate children's literature, for example, and show how there's certain books that we use, like the Earthlets book, that can share ideas about social and cultural context, also observation and inference. And then we also have the students create their own children's book for the conclusion of the semester, sort of like a children's literature book of their own that they can then use as a teacher. So it gives me an idea, do they understand nature of science well enough to create a book? And can they use that book with kids to help them learn the nature of science? So those are just a couple of ideas. And if you want, I have a list of children's books that I can email you if you want to email me, and the one that I use for my class, if you're interested in that. Anyone else have an idea for that?
You address literacy. I can speak to math a little bit.
That'd be great.
I'm not a math person, but just brainstorming off the top of my head. I mean, a lot of what we do in math can be heavily tied to data literacy, which is a big part of science being empirical, is that we use data and we use numbers and things like that. And so any tie with math to things like data representation is a really easy way to talk about science and math. I think that that's necessary, that you're first, implementing math or science lessons that are cross-curricular in the first place. I think that would be confusing to be teaching a math lesson and suddenly be talking about science. So it would need to be a math and science integrated lesson first, but then I think that there are very clear ties with science being empirical, definitely, and using number data and data representation in a way. I think that that's a good tie to math with NOS.
Yeah, that's true. So the next ones, do you think to have right now blended learning is important to train students to have online sessions in case lockdowns occurred in the future? Oh, that's an interesting one.
I can answer that.
Go for it.
Well, actually, what I was thinking, the answer is yes, because this is not the first time that the institutions were forced to go for online learning. When Katrina hit New Orleans and Mississippi, the schools were forced or asked to go for online learning. So then so rather just go for emergency online learning, it is always better to be prepared than never, because we do not know, this might not be the last pandemic. There might be some. We do not know.
Please,
So
Tully,
please be optimistic about the future. And the other thing is that when we are preparing, when we are in the online learning, we are finding ways to teach. So for an example, well, actually it was Show. Show has brought so when before the pandemic also I was teaching in OS, but we had our curriculum, we were teaching in OS, but when we went online, we cannot use some components of that, like paper materials and things. So then we all were finding innovative ways to teach nature of science. So then Show has find a video clip in Friends.
In Friends.
In Friends, Phoebe is telling to Rose about how that the model of the atom, how it was evolved. So people were believing in this and Plum model and so and so. Then they were believing in that, but now we know that it is not. Now, so how should we know that it is exactly the current model is the exact right one? We do not know. So then I was feeling so as my background is in chemistry, I was like, wow, this is the best nature of science lesson ever. So then so yeah, so that's an example. When we are in the online learning, when we are preparing for online learning, we are finding good ways, good methods, and innovative methods to teach in OS and other subjects as well.
So it's better to be prepared than have to do that in an emergency situation. Yeah, great.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that I think that it's, we're moving to obviously a global and more computer-based culture anyway. So emergency or not, I think we need to embrace online learning and figure and have great ways like your lesson to connect and to the students and yeah, and facilitate connections, you know, even when we're in that online environment.
I feel less scared if someone told me, oh, next semester I'm going to teach an online course. I feel, oh, it's okay.
Right.
The first time is, oh my God, how can I do it?
Yeah, I think we all felt that way, yeah. So that, based on your experiences, what do you think are the best, if not appropriate, teaching strategies in teaching nature of science in secondary or high school students in online learning, especially in areas with internet connectivity issues, which is so important? I'm sorry, got distracted. And areas with digital divide. That's such a good question, because it's so many rural areas that students don't have internet. That's such a good question. I've never taught high school, but what kinds of ideas can we brainstorm?
Well, what comes to mind for me is research and projects. And I know it's hard to research without internet connection, but you know, when we think about nature of science, I think it's helpful in secondary education, maybe especially, to think about the history of science. And, you know, and so that we can position ourselves to understand how it is tentative and subjective and culturally embedded and all of our tenets of science. So I think that as with online learning, we do need to develop some more projects that our students can, you know, become researchers on their own. To understand science practices, you know, so they can do their own independent research and then bring that back to the online environment to have these kinds of discussions. But I guess what I'm saying is really positioning our students as researchers of science as well.
I'm gonna add a little bit more to that. I'm loving what Claire is saying. I just want to maybe add a layer of social scientific issues. So even if you were to bring it into the context, for instance, in Franklin County, Indiana, there was a big thing about, oh Lord, there was a big thing we had where it was more individuals, was a higher cancer rate, pediatric cancer rate, and allowing students to have things like that. So when you bring it down from up here per se, but bring it into a context that is localized, I think it really helps to solidify nature of science and how we can do that. So just adding a little bit more to my colleague, if we kind of add that layer, I think it will help. And that doesn't really require a lot of online learning. Well, not online learning, but doesn't require a lot of extraness, if you know what I'm saying, if you bring it to where the students are.
Yeah, I would like to add another layer.
Of course, tonight, you know.
Because I never taught here in the US, but I guess for secondary or high school, students are supposed to do very intensive content learning. And so I suggest that, for example, you are learning chemistry, you are learning physics, you know, for the like structure of the atoms, you could bring the history, how people developing different kind of models to understand the structure of the atoms. So that brings nature of science.
I just want to add a small layer and also a reminder, just like nature of science does not require to taught only in the science content courses. You can use it in interdisciplinary. And when I believe there is no internet connection or area, there is a digital divide, I remember the context. Literature always helps. So you can find some literature where you can embedded the nature of science and can discuss, you can have a discussion with them. And I know all children literature also works, and there are other literatures for the higher education that you can use to taught the nature of science. So I think we need to get a little bit out of thinking that we need to have science content. It's not required to teach nature of science. You can find in interdisciplinary courses also.
Great. All right, we have like 1 minute, I think, if we end on time. Is there any last question or?
Can you put in gallery view so we can see other participants?
It might help to put your email address in the chat.
Yeah, I'll put my email address if anyone wants to contact us about anything, if I can see. It's far away from my computer to the screen. Is that
Is that my
Yes,
email?
that's right.
That's you.
That's me. Okay, thank you.